Welcome to this policy exchange fringe in association with Home Group. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to be talking about social housing today. I'm Isabel Hardman. I work for the Spectator. I used to be a housing journalist, and when I started at the Housing magazine, which was my first job, I didn't know anything about housing because my public affairs tutor had told me that it wasn't worth learning because nothing happened in the sector and policies never changed. So we're talking about how uncertain the social housing sector is today and how things really have changed in the past few years and what we might be able to expect in the next few years. And we've got a great panel to discuss that here. So on the panel is Don Foster, who's a Minister in the Communities and Local Government Department. Abigail Davies, who's Assistant Director of Policy and Practice at the Chartered Institute of Housing. Rosie Rose, Executive Director of Customer Services at Home Group, who are very kindly sponsoring this event, and Alex Morton, Head of Housing and Planning at Policy Exchange. So we're going to go to the speakers. They're going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then after that we'll open it up to questions from you on the floor. And we're going to start with Rosie.
Hello, good afternoon, and given the limited time I've got today, I very much want to focus on 3 key themes around the topic. The first for me is about social housing generally, and it's about meeting a basic need. It's about staying true to our core purpose of social housing in providing a decent and secure accommodation for those who need it. My second is affordable really affordable today? And the final one is not just about homes, but about the wider benefit a home brings, particularly to communities, enterprise and employment. Providing homes for the most vulnerable will always be a large part of what we do at Home Group, but it must not be all that we do. Excluding those who have the fortunate position of having access to the bank of mum and dad today, buying a home is not an option for a growing number of people in the UK. When a starter flat in Elephant and Castle costs around 375k, you can see why you would need a salary of around 65,000 and still be spending between 35 to 40% of your monthly income on your mortgage. There's also a very, very real danger that social housing, and is the case for many today, many now, is where poor people are concentrated, where disadvantage is frequently compounded in multiple ways and has been reinforced across the generations. We have a duty to house those who desperately need it, but if that's all we do, then we will have a profound effect on the communities that we work in. One size does not fit all today, and we should aim to develop something that's more positive, that is locally empowered, efficient and decentralised. Home Group believes that our sector needs to lead the debate on fairness and whether social housing is indeed having the required effect on regeneration, on community cohesion, enterprise and employment. Meeting these broader social and economic criteria creates tension with the need for new supply. There is no doubt about that. Whilst we have an allocation process based on need, that continues to concentrate what we believe is the poorest and most disadvantaged people within the existing limited stock that we have today. As part of that, housing providers have to work to overcome the public perception that some social housing today is misused. I can honestly say that I believe the reality is that that misuse is very, very rare. And we should really resist attempts to base housing policy around a very small number of isolated cases that we see in the media today. Pay-to-stay proposals are just such an example of that, and a somewhat crude mechanism, despite the fact that I believe in the strong moral argument behind it. Which brings me nicely onto my second point, affordable rents. We're now required on new schemes to look at affordability to a level of 80%, so it's 20% less than the market rate. That sounds reasonable enough, but on one scheme that I was recently involved with, in cash terms, that means a rent of £270 per week. That's not what most of us would understand as affordable, and in this case it was not a property in the heart of central London. In the end, we didn't proceed, as at Home Group it failed to meet our own affordability test, which after much research, supported by Savills, who we work with closely, has been set at 35% of disposable income. That has to be the maximum for people, and it's a level that we feel is fair and sustainable. My final point is on the wider economic benefits. As a provider, we want to see more homes of all tenures built, so it meets all needs of society. It's a numbers game, and quite frankly, we need more homes. With the private rented sector struggling to provide enough quality homes at affordable levels, social housing has a key role to play in helping overcome that market failure. Where do we expect the people who drive our buses, who work in our care homes, who serve us coffee, who do the myriad of other vital roles that drive service and national economic growth, where do we seriously expect them to live? We've got two significant suggestions that we want government to consider. One is something that we've called a New Homes Funding Vehicle, and we've generally modelled it on the Green Investment Bank, which we think provides a ready template to enable us to proceed very, very quickly. It would have one overriding objective, and that's generally to increase the supply of affordable housing in the UK, a supply that is drastically needed. It would be 100% state-owned, but run on an independent, arm's-length commercial basis. Its USP, if you like, would be long-term lending at cheap rates, and it would be government-backed. It would be expected to have extremely favourable ratings, allowing it to raise money on the capital markets at low rates, which would then be passed on to registered providers, housing associations and local authorities, with obviously a small margin to cover costs. It would allow the sector then to borrow on a long-term basis at highly competitive rates. Our second idea that we want government to consider is housing zones. Some people call them housing enterprise zones. And really this is about stimulating and supporting new development. It would have a menu of options instead of one size fits all. It would have give different areas, both deprived and those that have greater economic potential. It would provide them with the opportunity to experiment and give different interventions that is likely to provide the greatest assistance at the lower cost. So it's about a combination of things: reduced planning restrictions, greater use of compulsory purchase orders, VAT exemptions, and incentives for joint venture partnerships. All of these would be part of the potential mix moving forward. It could also be about ensuring that where permissions have been granted, that they are actually built. If there is a delay, then councils should be empowered to demand payment of the new homes bonus from a developer for each unit which has permission yet remains underdeveloped. That would go some way to dealing with the issue that the backlog in homes with planning permission yet to be built has been reduced by 6,000 in the past year. This is such a big topic that you can only cover a tiny section of it in the time available. So I want to end with a closing thought. I very much hope that the question politicians ask when writing their manifestos over the next 12 months is not what can we get for X billions of pounds, but what do we need to do to ensure that we get Britain building 250,000 homes each year for the next of the 2 or 3 parliaments. Because it's only then, with that approach, that we'll see housing create a safer, stronger and healthier society. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to hear from Abigail Davies from the Chartered Institute of Housing.
Hi, Rosie, you had 3 points, I've got 2, so I think by implication that means Alex has to make 1 killer point that blows you all away. I wanted to look at the purpose of social housing and how we pay for it. So firstly, looking at the purpose, you've got to know what the point of it is, otherwise you can't have a coherent policy framework. And I think for the last few governments we haven't had a coherent policy framework because they haven't been very clear on what the purpose of social housing is. For me, it seems quite clear. The housing market doesn't actually work very well, not just since 2008, but before then it didn't either. And social housing helps to counter that in terms of price and access. So the first objective is to provide rents at below market levels, and the second is to make sure that people have access to good quality accommodation that they're able to pay for. There have been a number of challenges to this in recent years, and not least an increasing desire to help deserving cases, so people who are working or volunteering or making a contribution to the community, perhaps getting extra priority over just anybody that might be housed. And you can see where that idea comes from, and it's quite easy to be sympathetic with it. But it's very hard to actually do it in practice unless the bottom end of the private rented sector works, or unless there's more housing supply. And actually the welfare reforms we've seen recently make this worse. And the reason I'm saying that is because private landlords are increasingly saying that they won't house people unless they're working a minimum of 16 hours because they don't understand the new benefit system and they're scared of the implications. And social landlords also increasingly actually saying that the bedroom tax and the advent of direct payment of housing benefit to their tenants increases the risk, and therefore they need to diversify more who they're housing. Now, I'm not on the point of criticising any of that. There's a perfectly solid business case behind those decisions, but I wanted to repeat something that echoed around the halls of CIH's annual conference in June, which is, so who's going to house the poor then, and what are the consequences of those decisions? And really, those observations really underline the need for a coherent, long-term, cross-tenure housing and welfare policy that fit together. So my second point then is about who's going to pay for it. Probably you're not going to be very surprised to hear me say that anything that operates outside of the market is going to require subsidy. And I wanted to stress that subsidy isn't actually a dirty word. We need it because the market doesn't work. It's not because that there's some problem with tenants who live in social housing. So where should the money come from? There's been, over the last 30 years, there's been a shift to revenue subsidy, which basically means getting housing benefit to pick up the bill, because in the short term it's cheaper for governments. But it's been happening for 30 years. It's quite a long-term problem that we're trying to deal with. So really let's shift back to capital subsidy and paying for bricks and mortar, cheaper houses that are settled. And I'm not sitting here just asking for a handout from government. Social landlords can find money to pay for the houses that they build, and they do. However, they can't find enough money to meet the need for supply and the need for the kind of community investment activities that Rosie mentioned. So they can't do it on their own. Recently, we've seen rents put up to help pay the affordable rent model with the up to 80% of market rents, which really leaves the lowest income households helping to fund the houses for their peers, which actually we've heard the idea of fairness running through this conference all week, and I'm not convinced that it is fair. Affordable rent does work for the short term. It helps the government out of the financial difficulties that it's got. Social landlords can make it work for a little while, but it's not a permanent solution to the funding and provision of social homes. So some key things that I really would like us to look at to help pay for social housing. First one is grant. Second, vote on this yesterday, local authority freedoms around borrowing and the way their revenue is accounted for. We can see improvements in the practice of asset management as well, so what landlords do with the homes that they already own. And also we need to look at some new systems. Rosie just talked about her new homes funding. Also things like the low-income housing tax credits that they have in America, which helps to find a funding stream which isn't relying just about the assets that the landlord owns to borrow against, but some alternative mechanisms to get money into the sector. So my big recommendations then, we need to find new entrants to help with housing supply, not just a range of different initiatives. Private house builders have built the same number of homes every year for about the last 100 years. Social landlords do their bit, but their bit cannot be enough. So let's look at who else can come and add capacity to this need for new supply. We also, as I said, we need a long-term, coherent policy that addresses all of the pressure points for everybody, and therefore helps to probably reduce the need for social housing. So I wanted to conclude by saying, well, social housing can't actually be for everybody, nice as it might be to have that. but it certainly can be for more people, and we can be much clearer about who, how and why we have it, if we're clearer about how we want the whole housing market to work, and if we're prepared to make bold interventions in that market. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And as I've got to start off one big point, I'll go with that first and then get back to detail. But the key one thing is that you need to think wider and see how social housing fits into the general housing crisis this country has. And ultimately, you have to fix the politics of planning. And if you don't do that, everything else just gets worse and worse. You're basically running up a down escalator. The housing market doesn't work, but in a sense, the housing market doesn't really exist in this country. You have councils deciding on how many homes are built, where they're built. You have huge amounts of regulation, both at the national and local level, saying what they look like. So the idea that we have a sort of market for new homes isn't really a sort of good way to characterise it. And of course, we did build more homes than 100,000 privately in the 1930s. So since the 1947 Town Country Planning Act, we haven't really managed to increase private housing, but before that, housing used to be quite responsive to demand. So that's sort of the big picture, but now, to zoom back into social housing is necessary in the medium term. There are, for a long time, going to be a lot of people on low incomes who need it, particularly in certain regions, and even past that, there's always going to be people who can't afford market rents for whatever reason. Often they're cycling in and out of low-paid work, disabled, etc. And that's right that it should be subsidised. So I agree with Abby there. The waiting list it's an interesting point, of course, how many people need social housing? Because the waiting list in the heyday of Right to Buy, the waiting list fell. And what was happening was that because people could afford private housing, people would go into social housing because they needed it, and then they'd move to a private house, use their buy, and so exit that and then leave it for someone else. Of course, nowadays, no one, particularly in high demand areas, ever leaves social housing, other than basically through death. Because why on earth would you give up what is a subsidised rent and a tenant who treats you quite well, move into an insecure private sector where you don't think you're going to be able to afford your own home? So that core point, you have to fix private housing, otherwise you'll just get more and more need, which the government just simply is not financially able to cope with, gets worse and worse. So that's one way in which social housing crosses over private housing. The second point, of course, goes back to politics of planning. People do not automatically go great if social housing is proposed, just they don't go great when new housing is proposed. You need to fix the NIMBY problem and reduce the reasons that people are NIMBYs if you're going to build more social housing, just as much as if you're going to build more private housing. So we shouldn't see fixing the planning system as just helping build more private housing. It's also something we're going to need to do if you want to build more social housing. Where will the money come from? The government has committed to the middle of the next Parliament to a funding package of several billion. You can argue whether that's enough or not, but it's there, and then we'll have a decision in midway through the next Parliament what we're going to do. We do think that the asset management policies of social landlords and councils have to get a lot better. So we did a big piece of work last year looking at how many valuable properties there were, and we defined valuable properties as worth more than the average in their region, adjusted by bedroom size. So obviously a two-bedroom house in London versus a four-bedroom house in the North East. And we found that locked up there is about £6 billion a year just from empty properties. So unlike the bedroom tax, this doesn't ask anyone to move. What this is about is saying when you have a vacant property, you assess it, and if it's above a certain value, you sell it, and you build 3 houses, and you get 3 families off the waiting list rather than one. And that is the principle the government's taken on board in something for something deals, and I really hope the government pushes hard on that. I think there is a question about how you define expensive properties, and different people of different political persuasions will be more or less comfortable with what a sort of expensive council house is. But there is no doubt in my mind that you should not have a situation where you have £1 million townhouses, which is the current one in some parts of London that are council properties, when you could have 10 families being housed, in slightly further out, use that, recycle it, and the back of the envelope calculations were that you could build 80,000 to 150,000 homes every year just from the receipts from that, and that was using data from the English Housing Survey. So there's also a point about longer term choice for tenants. I hope at some point we can get back to an agenda to kind of dive, which is more movement within tenants, within housing associations. I think it's something it would be good to try and help people who want to move, particularly want to take up work. within the sector. It's one of those things that the government does, but it never quite seems to get it right, in that you help people to move from one borough to another if they're going to take up work and they're sort of someone who's cycling in and out of work. That can be a very positive intervention, and I don't think we've quite managed to get that fixed yet. The question on who housed before us, and it's a reminder that though we may disagree with Charles Institute of Housing, they do have the interests of the people who they're helping at heart. I think they're very right to raise the alarm. The problem is that as need gets greater, there is a push to say, well, we as housing associations and councils must help people in the middle. But at that point, who is going to house? Are we just going to completely abandon those who are near the bottom? I think we have to focus social housing on those who need it most, while making some allowances. For example, if people want to move into work and they want a council house, and that facilitates that. I think you can't go be completely needs-based, but you have to keep that as, unfortunately, the key principle while you fix private renting. In the long run, of course, if you fix private housing, lots of those people who are working move out of the sector anyway, which I personally don't think is a bad thing, because it means that you have less pressure and less people competing for the same amount of homes. So there you have it. That's what we would do. We think the government needs to massively focus on fixing the politics of planning, building lots more houses. That will reduce the demand for social housing, which will help with a lot of these difficult dilemmas of who should social housing be for. We think that the sector itself has to look at better asset management policies. There just isn't very much money at the moment. Regardless of your politics, when you've got a deficit of 122 billion a year, it's going to be very difficult to say we're going to generate billions and billions to pay into housing. So focus on those two things, I think, and you'll manage to sort of steer a course that will help most people in the social housing sector while fixing a wider social and economic problem.
Guys, I'm in a real difficulty. I mean, there are some of you in this room who followed me around and went to all 6 housing fringes that I did yesterday. It's almost impossible to come up with new things that I can say, but let me try. But as a starter for 10, like Alex and like others, it is important that we put the social housing agenda within the wider housing agenda. Namely, we need more houses. We build more even double garage, 4-bedroom mock Georgian houses. That actually does help free up opportunities elsewhere. We've got to be having all tenures considered, and that means we do have to address some of the wider issues that again Alex touched on, which is the planning issues where we have got problems. That's why the party's having a review of planning policy. We have to look at the issue of infrastructure. We have to look at the issues of land availability and freeing up government and local government land more easily. And those are all areas where work is either ongoing or changes have been made by the coalition government. But we can't lose sight of all of those when we look at one particular aspect of housing in the way that we're doing. But in looking at that one particular area, we start with the knowledge that the Labour legacy was an economic disaster, but it was also a social housing disaster. With at the end of 13 years in office, we had 420,000 fewer social houses than when they had come to office. And we're not going to be able to replace all of those overnight. You know that when the coalition came into office, we made a commitment to put in £4.5 billion, which would lever in private sector money, giving £19.5 billion, which we said would create us by the end of 2015 170,000 additional affordable homes. A year or so later, we then said there are a lot of sites that got planning permission but are not being developed, and therefore we'll do something about it. We will allow the renegotiation of Section 106. And the Liberal Democrats got very concerned about that because it could mean that many of the sites would lose affordable homes there. Of course, you could argue if they weren't being built at all, we weren't getting any affordable homes, but leaving aside that, we actually at our conference a year ago said, Don, go away and sort this out, this isn't right. So you'd be delighted to know that I did go away and sort it out. I sorted it out so that those renegotiations had to be public, that no commercial and in-confidence information could be used as part of the basis. We also got agreement that where it was identified the site currently with a number of affordable homes wasn't viable, that it would be possible for a bid to be put in for the extra money that we also were able to negotiate, an additional £450 million in cash and £10 billion in loan guarantee to be used to provide extra funding for that site to go ahead, ensuring we continue to have what for the Liberal Democrats is so important, which is mixed developments of sites. So we succeeded on that one. But then we also had the autumn statement where we've made very clear that we're going to put in a further slug of money, £3.3 billion, to lever in up to £20 billion of private sector money to get us in just 3 years an additional 165,000 homes, which will mean the fastest building rate of social homes for something like 20 years. Now you say, oh, that sounds very fine, big sums of money and so on. The truth is that we are absolutely bang on target. I can tell you today that halfway through the programme for the 170,000 homes, we've already built 84,000 and far more are starting. So we're well on the way to achieving the target, and I think we're going to exceed it. We've done a number of other things that I think are really important, giving real incentives to local authorities to engage in this through the New Homes Bonus. We can have a debate about the recent announcement in terms of top slicing if people want to. But we've also done a number of things that I think are important about improving the stock that we've got, which is why the £1.6 billion that we will spend on the Decent Home programme is so vitally important. And the other thing that Alex touched on is we must also remember that the sort of people who might be using social housing may well increasingly be helped through housing benefit, what its proper name, in the privately rented sector. And we have to grow the privately rented sector to enable that to be a possibility, and work is going on that front. It still leaves problems to do with security of tenure in the privately rented sector. It still addresses issues of some bad landlords and so on, which we're beginning to address with the recent commitment to introduce a redress scheme and so on. But there is more work to be done in that area, and more work will be done in that area. And I was delighted to be able to announce yesterday a further measure that I think will help in a small way. It's a measure that will help self-builders to be able to get on the bill, but if they build a package of houses where some of them are not for their own use, we're giving them access to £65 million of cash to help them produce developments where some of the houses will be self-built for themselves and some will be affordable homes that they'll hand over to a relevant housing association. And the other thing that we've done, and we debated this in conference yesterday, is we've said that local councils who retain council housing should have the ability to do more. So we've freed up their whole housing revenue account with a cap imposed on it. Now, the debate we had yesterday I think is a really important one, because what we said yesterday was that what we should be doing as a party in this period of time in the coalition up until 2015 is we should be saying there is something we can do that's even better than we've currently got. And that is to recognise that with under the cap at the moment there is still £2.3 billion worth of investment opportunity. The cap is not fully used, and therefore we ought to find a mechanism whereby those councils who want to use that spare capacity should be able to get it from those councils who have the spare capacity that don't want to use it. Now that's what the motion that you voted for actually said. And some of you said we should go further, and you said we should abandon that bit and simply say, let's remove the cap altogether and allow councils to be able to borrow under prudential borrowing rules, because after all they can build schools and hospitals and nightclubs and almost anything else, but they can't build housing, and that's really weird. I have great sympathy with that. The reason why that particular proposal was rejected by Nick Clegg was quite simple, because the motion specifically referred to the period at the time up to 2015. What our policy as Liberal Democrats should be about freeing up the local authorities is for conference to decide in due course, and it will be in the manifesto. But my vote will be for a system that does provide that freedom to local councils. That is what I want us to see. I'm also delighted that the vast majority of the leadership of the LGA are absolutely behind that. and from the speeches of the conference floor, I guess there's a huge amount of support. I've three other things I want to say very quickly, and then I'll shut up. The first thing is this, that when we talk about social housing, and I'll happily engage in conversations about innovative ways of financing, because I think that's a really exciting opportunity. But I think we also ought to recognise some of the real innovations that are going on in social housing and not been referred to by the panellists, so I'll pick them up since they haven't been. The first is that as well as local councils, we have very many brilliantly good housing associations who are there in the provision of and the running of social housing around the country. And if you're not aware of this, the changing role of housing associations in recent years has been absolutely astronomical. And very many of them now are doing far more than building houses and then maintaining them for the people who are living in there. Very many of them are engaging in a wide range of social activity that includes, for example, helping their tenants to upskill, helping their tenants to get into jobs. There's some fantastic work that's going on in there. And I, for one, think it's a great shame that contracts to the work programme are long-term, have already been fixed, because I think it's a shame that some housing associations that do some really valuable work in this field do not get recognised out of the work programme contracts. And when we come to renew those, I think it's vitally important that we take account of that. But equally, coming to Alex's point about financing, we have to perhaps think of ways in which that additional work that housing associations do can actually be rewarded other than through the rental income that they're able to get. And I think that may be part of the package of doing it. I think it's also important to recognise the changing role that tenants in social housing are playing, because we're seeing with council houses the increased role of ALMOs, arm length management organisations, with tenant involvement, tenant panels and so on, and we're seeing in some of our housing association areas the growing and developing work of tenant management organisations who are doing some fantastic work and really taking control of what happens in their area and so on. I think that's really, really exciting. The final thing, my third point, that hasn't been mentioned, is that we keep talking about the building of new stock, and actually social housing will come also from making much better use of existing stock. That is, much more work needs to be done in terms of empty homes being brought back into use specifically for social housing. It means looking at the real opportunity of changes to permitted development to use empty commercial properties for use for residential, making better use of empty retail premises for residential. And not a single one of you in this room is not aware of an empty space above a shop in your town or in your city that should be being used for social housing to really help the renovation of our high streets and to provide more affordable housing. So permitted development changes more in terms of empty homes work is something we do. But I look forward to hearing the debate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. We're now going to go to questions. I can see lots of you are very keen to ask. So we'll start, I think, have we got a mic? You're just going to shout. So let's start on the front row there, the chap with the amazing tie.
A Welsh tie.
A Welsh tie, indeed. Don's point about making use of existing properties is very right, and certainly in terms of empty homes. But is it not the case that the biggest single reform you can do to improve that and to make the best use of money is to reduce VAT on repairs to 5%?
Okay, thank you. We'll take two more and then we'll stand in front.
Very quick question for Don and then one for Alex. Excuse my ignorance, Don, but this bit about pooling local authorities' housing authority, has that been approved by the Treasury as far as you're aware? Is that something we...
Sorry, I just very quickly to save a lot of time answering. I'm at a Liberal Democrat conference. I heard what the Liberal Democrats voted for. I have personally, as the Minister, been fighting for this. I haven't heard a government announcement on that yet.
Okay, right, okay. Alex, when you talked about freeing up the planning process, and I know you've advocated local referendums in order to get over the NIMBY aspect, but in terms of what local authorities should or should not be allowed to do when they get a planning request, what in your view should councils legitimately be able to say about it, and not in your view should they should not be allowed to influence at all about the plans that comes from.
One question I was going to ask, which I'm delighted Don has answered, that was I was going to say, what about the use of brownfield site? You have said a lot about that. But that is also related to with the social mix aspect, which both Rosie and Alex mentioned. I was very concerned that Alex said, well, you have to do this route of people from very more affluent areas a little bit down the road. But these are the very people who won't be able to afford to get into the centre to do all the work that the people living more in the centre would want them to do. And I wanted to ask Rosie what your organisation's experience is with this. I mean, I don't think we want a ghettoisation of housing.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move along the panel, and if the speakers don't want to answer a question, that's fine. Alex, if you want to start.
Okay. I'll start with the last question, then the second one about councils. So what we were saying is that social housing should be mixed in, but it shouldn't be above a certain value. We also said it shouldn't be below a certain value. So what we would have a cap at about the average, and sort of at the lower quartile. So what you basically be doing is building those kind of terrace houses and red brick flats that everyone sort of recognises as the interwall council properties. And yes, they might be in Tottenham rather than Islington. The question is it worth that, the fact that you're housing, or it might be in one village along rather than the next, or within Glasgow, it might not be. You might sell off the properties that are in the West End and move slightly south or slightly north. If the question is it worth getting, say, 2 or 3 or 4 families off for that one property? We're not talking about a programme saying social housing should be in the worst of the worst areas. That would be absurd. No one's going to argue that. But when you have a very, very valuable property and you have a lot of people on the waiting list, I don't think it's right for that family to say, well, actually, I think I should be able to live exactly where I would like. I'm not prepared to accept that I should commute a little bit, like almost 90% of the British public do. And when you look at the employment rates by region, broken down by value, don't change. So putting people in those expensive houses doesn't make them any more likely to get a job. So if the goal of this property is to help those people, which it should be, it isn't working. And the cost of doing that means that somewhere else there is someone who's living in overcrowded accommodation, in bad, rented accommodation with milk off the walls because that family demands living in a different area. So I make no apology for saying you shouldn't live everywhere, but I don't think that means mixing in half all areas doesn't mean ghettoisation. On the point about local authorities, I would say very little. What they should be able to decree. Now that doesn't mean that they can't do very much, because good councillors are leaders in a particular area. And if something is being proposed in your ward, I would imagine that you're going to be engaged in that and you want to help drive it through. But for example, one of the problems in some areas that I speak to, you have a district council which is headquartered in the town, which is very pro-density, for example, and you have the town, which is fine, it's perfectly sensible, you have reason you might have a high density, and then you have lots of villages. And in each of the little villages, when a house gets knocked down, they try and cram in flats because the council has a policy of being pro-density. And what that means is, rather than the villagers who might have accepted sort of a low-density development, will then become up in arms, and instead of getting the community behind it and the council acting as someone who is helping mediate, you have someone who's imposing something and turning the community against what could have been an accepted and a popular development. I think the planning system fundamentally has to shift from something that is done to people. I think negative plans might work, but I think we're probably going to have to go much further. The planning system fundamentally has to shift from something in a 1940s way where someone comes along from the planning inspectorate and does something to someone, and it is a plan that is imposed over a 20-year period, to something that is much more flexible and is on a case-by-case basis, and you have to win the consent of those who are going to be most affected by it. I don't think in a society that has property rights and is generally, people feel, this is my house, I care about it, I love the area I live in, I don't think you're going to be able to get to the 250, 300,000 homes that we need without that fundamental shift.
Okay. 2 points. One, to follow up on the gentleman's clarification about whether the Treasury is on board or not. A bit of an appeal to Don, if you could do something to help with this, because it's something we've been asking to get on the agenda for ages. The Treasurer always finds a reason why it can't possibly happen, and actually we do need new entrants to the housing supply arena. Local authorities are an obvious one. I think the payoffs are worse than the are better. The payouts are much better than the costs. So an advocate would be very helpful there. And then on the point about selling off valuable assets, it's only been a couple of years actually that housing associations have really been allowed to manage their assets properly, because they've always in the past been regulated debt, so they couldn't.
Yeah.
So I think the practice of asset management is really growing and strengthening, and people are becoming a lot more sophisticated. It's good to hear Alex kind of tempering the point with, but don't ghettoise, don't just go to the poorer areas. We need to remember, take an extreme example. Why do you provide homeless services in expensive city centre properties? It's because that's where the homeless people are, so you need to go to them. So let's please not have some kind of mandatory system that requires landlords to behave in particular ways, but let's encourage and expect them to have a decent understanding of the market and to make proper use of the assets they've got, but prescribing some kind of national rule won't be helpful, because it won't get us to the place we need to be.
You're making some disapproving noises.
Well, I was making disapproving noises for two reasons. The first was, if I was not as knackered as I am, and if I was not sitting with two people in between me, I would have actually strangled Alex for something he just said, when he said that neighbourhood planning might work, but we'll have to take it further. Alex, get into the real world of what's going on out there. It is working. You've got situations where relatively low income areas are told by their local council they have to have X number of houses, and they're going back and say we want even more in our area. Where people that said they were totally against a supermarket being imposed on them when given a choice as to what supermarket and where it was, and voted 97% in favour of now having a supermarket, having campaigned against any supermarket before they had the neighbourhood plan, when they're actually getting a major cash incentive for doing the work with the SIL uplift benefits that they get, when there are actually 250 communities who are queuing up to try and desperately get onto the neighbourhood planning route on top of the 500 that are already there. When if you go to Exeter St James referendum turnout, which took place on the same day as the local council elections last May, there were more people went in and cast their ballot for or against, well mainly for, as it happens, the referendum for the neighbourhood ballot than bothered to stay on and stick another cross in a box who their local councillor would be. Alex, please don't tell me that neighbourhood planning might get there. Neighbourhood planning is alive, well and doing phenomenally well, and is a key part of where we're going to go. And I have to say, I will give some consideration as to whether I might or might not champion the idea of giving greater flexibility for use of the money under the cap. But I would just query how the hell those words got into a Liberal Democrat motion, and how we got to a situation where not just Don Foster stuck his hand up for it, but the Deputy Prime Minister of this country urged everybody to vote for it, and urged everybody to vote for it to happen, not after 2015, but before 2015. We Liberal Democrats are fully on board. We're determined to do all we can. There is another part of the coalition, and we're working hard, but come and join us in that campaign to make it happen. In terms of Peter's thing about VAT on repairs, Peter, I am 100% behind an equalisation of VAT between new build and repair and refurbishment. But I have to tell you, and it is party policy, and it was in our last general election, but we were absolutely hammered by the Tories over this, and I'll tell you why. Because if you're in favour of equalisation of VAT, at the moment there's no VAT on new build, whereas you pay full VAT on repair and maintenance. If you are moving towards increasing from zero to something VAT on new build, then we have got to find a way of overcoming the argument with proper research evidence that shows this will not have a net drag down of the number of properties that become available. And those sums are not that easy to demonstrate, which is why we're having research done, and the Policy Exchange is just about to agree in return for its ridiculous comments about neighbourhood planning to agree to help us with that research.
I have to to come back on neighbourhood plans, partly because Nick Bowles obviously found this, as now the planning minister will also strangle me if I don't qualify them. So we argue for a referendum of neighbourhood plans, we argue for seal going to neighbourhoods, and I think neighbourhood plans are a fantastic idea. I think they're one of the best things this government's done in planning.
Excellent.
My worry is, will they get to a critical velocity by 2015? Will the next government, if it is a particularly Labour majority government, will they go along with it, or will they seek to put local authority back? And my final worry is that there has not yet been a real test case where local people say, this is what our neighbourhood plan says, and the council says, well, that's very interesting, but actually planning document number 13 says this, so get stuck. And there has not really been a really big case yet where the government has had to choose between offending councils or basically saying, well, actually neighbourhood plans override, almost all intents and purposes, local
Alex,
authority.
the world will get really tired of us, you and I, having a debate about the reality of it. With Nick Bowles, I am the jointly responsible minister for it. I have almost weekly briefing on where we are in each and every one. If you are looking forward to there being a really big bust-up between the neighbourhood and the council, and you think we haven't had one, I will just give you a heads up. We're about to have 4. If you really think that there aren't real opportunities for making a real difference and embedding this in a way that no future government would dare do anything about removing it, I think by 2015 we will be there. I'm fairly confident. I've got a very good handle on how many will have gone through referendum. Whether successful or not, it's for local people to decide, even by the end of this year. I've described this as the quiet revolution. You can judge by my enthusiasm and excitement that this is getting a very noisy resolution, and I'm going to speak louder and louder about it because communities really like it. And I'll tell you one other thing I've just announced. That I think is right, that if a community gets together and is willing to put in all the time and effort of doing this work, and incidentally I announced some additional money to help them do that, I also think they prove that they deserve, if they so wish it, to be able to very quickly get on to having a parish or neighbourhood council if they haven't got one, to give democratic legitimacy to some of the work they're doing. So earlier this week I announced that I'm going to make that just something that they can do automatically and get on with it to save a lot of time. And there are a lot of people excited about that as well. It is a real change that's happening at sea change.
I'm going to stop you before you.
I didn't actually argue for equalisation.
No, sorry, can we?
Oh, really?
I said 5%, you could leave new build at 0%.
If you two could debate afterwards, it's just there's lots of people with their hands up.
I was
We haven't even
talking
got to
about
Rosie
us.
yet.
I know party policy is.
And I don't want anyone to strangle anyone either. So
But I'm not
Rosie,
going to
so you
say,
go.
I'm not going to say anything contentious because you're rather closer to me than you are to mine. On the point of VAT reduction on repairs, obviously as Hungary we'd welcome that on the basis that we spend over sort of £50 million of repairs each year, and that would be significant reinvestment in either sort of our current homes or in terms of new development. Just in the lady's point there around sort of the development of brownfield sites and not creating ghettos. I think for us, we would welcome the sort of development of brownfield sites for the fact that it would create a huge number of new homes. But we're always conscious that we would not want that to be an area of last resort or a place where sort of people of low income went en masse. And I suppose I look at it from the point of view is we see a huge number of developments go through each year, and they're probably 30, 40, 50 homes. But very rarely do we see large-scale developments consider sort of what that would need in terms of infrastructure, enterprise and employment. And I think the two need to be closely connected. So there needs to be demand for those homes, but there also needs to be things in place that would make sure that those communities thrive, and we would be very, very conscious of making sure where our developments are that infrastructure would exist. And I'm also keen to see things happen like the National Mobility Scheme, which has recently been launched, allows people to move from their current homes if they wish to sort of like seek employment, but go across boundaries of local authorities. They're not constrained by their current choice-based letting schemes or their nomination rights, and they can move right across the country and see the homes that are available to them in areas that they wouldn't normally have visibility of. And I think it's in creating those options and opportunities that we give people more choice and the ability to move and be sort of more mobile generally.
Very good.
I think we can through another round of questions. So chap there with the red striped tie, you.
House Ned and Angus and Mearns. I wanted to ask if the right to buy legislation is still perceived as any sort of constraint on any social housing provider, obviously most of councils. The reason for asking is that I remember an enthusiastic Tory councillor at the time that legislation came in saying that this would end the wicked monopoly council social providers and open up a real market in for affordable housing. Well, everything that's been said today so far suggests there ain't no such market, and that what is needed is large slugs of money, either from the banks in the private sector or from the governments in the public sector. So is the right to buy still acting as any sort of constraint by making it harder to borrow money, for example, because the long-term ownership of the property is uncertain?
Okay, another question made there.
Kelsey Learning from Winchester, where incidentally we've been selling off high value homes in the centre of town for years because they're very expensive to maintain. We've got a development in the south of our district, several thousand homes. The developer is actually looking at the 40% affordable housing they've got to provide, doing it themselves and retaining ownership, because at 80% of market rent they see it as being a good investment. How does the panel feel about that kind of thing?
Okay. Another question from there, Rosemary.
Tim Nichols from Child Poverty Action Group. Don, we really recognise the work that housing associations are doing, helping their tenants into employment as well. But please don't bring them anywhere near the work programme. The work programme is proven to be a disaster. This mistake has been made already, trying to bring charities and voluntary organisations into it. Politicians saw them as the goose that laid the golden egg. Putting them into the work programme is trying to take that goose and put it into a factory farm situation. The work programme is embedded as well into this awful Kafkaesque sanctions bureaucracy that doesn't allow for the trusting relationships that are needed. Maybe you should scrap the work programme and send a load of that subsidy to the housing associations and just let them get on with the good job they're doing.
Okay, we'll start at this end, Rosie, right away back along.
I think just in the essence of time, I'll answer the last question. I think we do, as a housing association, do a huge amount of work individually with our customers and our clients and our tenants generally to help them try and seek employment and acquire those skills to move on and become more mobile. In terms of the work programme, we would welcome, again, what Don said earlier that says, you know, when it comes up for renewal, is there another way of doing it to involve us and make sure that we're able to use those skills and that relationship that we currently have with our customers and clients, that I think is much more closer than we currently have within the current work programmes, and leverage sort of that to see what could be achieved in local communities rather than what we have today. So I welcome what Don said about sort of considering something different at renewal.
Well, I agree with what I said about it. I agree. I'm a government minister, and I'm not going to be tempted down making any comments that will get me over the front pages as to what I think about the current configuration of the work programme. But I said what I said, that I think housing associations are doing some incredibly valuable work in this field. I do believe that we have to find ways of ensuring that they continue to do that, and if possible to find ways of financially rewarding them to help them continue to do this and the other work that they do. I also love the notion that some developer, Whitney Holmes, Barrett's, whoever it might be, has now concluded that they can let out properties at 80% of the market rent and it's a money maker. But if they wish to do that, then I suggest they go on and do it as a straightforward market venture, and good luck to them and thank you very much. If they wish to do it and take on those people identified on the housing list for local council, then clearly they can do that. They can establish themselves as a housing association and register with the regulators to so do it. I'm encouraged that that's possible, and so that's very good. In terms of the right to buy and the question about is there a real market for affordable homes, the reality is no, there isn't a real market for affordable homes, although we're beginning to hear that there might be one, so maybe the world is changing, but I'm not aware of it. The big difference about the right to buy under the coalition governments and under the previous government, that we have put in a replacement scheme as part of the package. Now, we describe it as a one-for-one replacement, and of course it's not a one-for-one replacement in the normal sense, because you don't sell it and get enough money to build a new house, but you do get enough money from the sale of that house to then be able to use in the private sector. That's what we've insisted in doing, and that's actually what's happening, and I welcome the change that we made.
Okay. I've just been given a gesture which I think is about ending the fringe rather than what's going on between Alex and Don. Over.
We can do that outside.
If Abby and Alex want to add anything just before we close, then.
Two really quick ones then. The right to buy obviously starting to look very different in different parts of the UK, but the English policy, which has just been described, not a massive constraint in terms of expectations and loss of stock, but I think the one-for-one replacement is still a challenge. I think nationally you probably can get one-for-one. In individual areas you can't necessarily. In London you probably can, in Wigan you probably can't, so there's some community accountability issues there, and I shall stop.
Just to illustrate, I feel my collar around my neck, just to continue to go, it's great that neighbourhood plans are, clearly there is a question of local people and councils. The government will say local people will decide, particularly given that neighbourhood plans, the idea of both local people and incentives, a lot of that was on the Policy Exchange 2010 paper, which I wrote. So, I'm all about neighbourhood plans.
We thank you.
Great, well on that note we'll finish. Thank you so much to our speakers who've come, and thank you to you for coming as well. It's lovely to have you.
Yeah, what kind of this event, the Julia event as well.
Okay.